The wine bottle felt heavy in my hand as I moved around the table. Our dining room glowed with soft candlelight, and the crystal glasses sparkled like tiny stars. I had spent 3 full days preparing this dinner for Edward's potential investors. The beef Wellington sat perfectly golden on the serving platter, and the roasted vegetables gleamed with herb butter. I reached Edward's glass and began to pour the Cabernet, a $200 bottle I had chosen myself from the wine shop downtown last week. That's when I heard him laugh. It was the kind of laugh that made everyone else at the table join in, even though I hadn't caught the joke. "Don't mind her," Edward said, waving his hand toward me like I was some annoying insect buzzing near his ear. "She's the domestic glue around here. Totally useless at a spreadsheet, but she makes a mean pot roast." The words hung in the air like smoke. The investors chuckled politely. I felt my neck burn hot, but my hand stayed perfectly steady. I finished pouring his wine, adjusted the napkin beside his plate, and smiled softly at no one in particular. My face was a mask of calm. "My name is Melanie, and I'm 32 years old." To everyone sitting at that table, I was just part of the furniture, something pretty and expected to stay quietly in place. But what Edward always seemed to forget was that before I became the wife, I had been someone else entirely. I graduated at the top of my class in business analytics, while Edward was still figuring out how to color-code his calendar properly. My professors had called me exceptional. Companies had competed to hire me. I spent my 20s building financial systems for major corporations. I spent my early 30s building Edward's career, piece by careful piece. As I caught my reflection in the buffet mirror across the room, I didn't see a victim staring back at me. I saw a woman who had been playing a very long, very quiet game, and I was getting close to checkmate. The pieces were all in position now. The investors kept talking, their voices blending into background noise. I sat down at my place and cut into my pot roast, chewing slowly and deliberately. The table had gone silent for just a split second after Edward's comment. I felt the weight of their eyes on me, some pitying, some just uncomfortable. But I didn't flinch or correct him. I didn't mention my degree from a top business school or the consulting work I did late at night while he snored loudly in our bed. I just ate my dinner and smiled warmly when someone complimented the food. One woman told me the Wellington was restaurant quality. Edward launched into a story about his latest business triumph, a triumph I had actually engineered while he was playing golf with his buddies. He described the market analysis like he had done it himself, gesturing wildly with his wine glass and puffing his chest. The investors nodded and took careful notes. I refilled water glasses and cleared plates silently. When dessert came out, Edward toasted to new partnerships and brilliant futures. Everyone raised their glasses high. I raised mine too, but I was toasting something different. I was toasting to endings and new beginnings. Over the next month, I became invisible in my own home. I stopped correcting Edward's mistakes, which happened more often than anyone realized. When he proudly announced he had handled the property tax payment, I just nodded and smiled, even though I had paid it 2 weeks earlier with my own money. When he couldn't find important documents for his meetings, I didn't help him search. I just shrugged and suggested he check his office more carefully. I started a folder on my laptop that I titled Project Foundation. Inside, I kept careful records of everything. Every email I had written for him, every report I had created from scratch, every financial decision I had made while he took full credit at company meetings and dinners. The folder grew thicker each day. I also started taking on my own clients, high-level consulting work under my maiden name, Miller. Edward never asked what I did on my computer for hours each night. He assumed I was shopping online or looking at recipes for dinner parties. The truth was simple but devastating. For 3 years, I had been ghostwriting Edward's quarterly reports. Those brilliant market predictions everyone praised him for? Those were mine. I spent hours analyzing data, building complex models, and crafting presentations that made him look like a genius in front of his bosses. He would glance at them for 10 minutes, change a few words to feel important, and then present them as his own work. He never thanked me. Now I was channeling that same expertise into my own business. Companies were paying me thousands of dollars for the same analysis I had been giving Edward for free. I worked under Miller Consulting, and my client list was growing every single week. I opened a separate bank account he didn't know about. I built a safety net he couldn't touch or control, and I waited patiently for the right moment. Edward came home one evening practically vibrating with excitement. He grabbed my shoulders and kissed my forehead like I was a child who had done something cute. "Melanie, this is it," he said, his eyes shining. "I'm up for senior partner. This is everything we've worked for." His grip on my shoulders was tight. I noticed he said "we," but meant me. He always did that. He explained that the final decision would be made after a massive gala he needed to host at our house. All the senior leadership would attend, along with board members and key investors from across the country. "This has to be perfect," he said, staring at me hard. "Try not to look overwhelmed this time, okay? And please, leave the business talk to the men. Just focus on making everything look nice and pretty." I smiled and nodded. "Of course, Edward. I'll make sure everything is absolutely perfect." And I meant it. Just not in the way he thought I did. I discovered something interesting while organizing our financial documents one quiet afternoon. Edward hadn't looked at our joint brokerage account in over a year. He thought I was spending my allowance on shoes and home decor from expensive stores. He had no idea I had been quietly moving money, diversifying investments, and building an entire financial structure he couldn't access or even see. I had created a private LLC months ago. Every consulting payment went directly into accounts tied to that company. I had been careful, methodical, and incredibly patient. Edward's name wasn't on any of it. His signature wasn't required for any transactions. Legally, everything I had built was mine alone. My lawyer had made sure of it. I sat in our home office one afternoon, looking at spreadsheets that showed my growing wealth. Edward was downstairs watching television, probably assuming I was ordering napkins for his precious gala. I smiled at the screen and saved my work carefully. 2 weeks before the gala, Edward hosted a Sunday brunch for some colleagues. I made fresh pastries from scratch and squeezed orange juice by hand until my arms ached. While I refilled coffee cups and cleared plates, Edward told a story about how I would be completely lost without his guidance and support. His friends laughed, and one of them patted his shoulder like he deserved a medal for putting up with me. But I noticed a woman across the table watching me carefully. Her name was Diane, and I recognized her from industry conferences I had attended under my Miller identity. Our eyes met across the table, and I gave her the smallest, most knowing smirk. Her expression changed immediately. Her eyes narrowed, and I could see her mind working, putting pieces together like a puzzle. She didn't say anything out loud, but I knew she understood, and that made me feel powerful and validated. While Edward was away on what he called a business trip, though I knew he was actually spending the weekend at a casino losing money, I had our house appraised. The appraiser was thorough and discreet, just as I had requested. When she gave me the final number, I nearly laughed out loud in surprise and satisfaction. Our house was worth 40% more than Edward thought. But more importantly, I discovered something fascinating about the deed. Years ago, Edward had put the house into a holding company for tax purposes. He had done it quickly, signing papers his lawyer prepared without reading them carefully. He never checked on it again. It was one of many things he ignored. Over the past 6 months, I had been quietly purchasing shares of that holding company using dividends from my investments. Last week, I had bought the final shares I needed. The holding company was now mine, which meant the house was mine. Edward was living in my property and didn't even know it. The irony was delicious. Edward stormed into the kitchen one evening, his face red with frustration and anger. "Where's the blue folder?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "I need it for my presentation tomorrow morning. This is really important, Melanie." I looked up from chopping vegetables for dinner. "I haven't seen it, honey. Did you check your office carefully?" My voice was sweet and concerned. He glared at me like I was being deliberately unhelpful. "Of course I checked my office. It's not there. You must have moved it somewhere." I shrugged and went back to chopping carrots. "Sorry, I don't know what to tell you. Maybe you misplaced it." For the first time in years, Edward had to build his own presentation from scratch. He stayed up until 3 in the morning, and I could hear him swearing at his computer through the walls. He didn't know how his own formulas worked. He didn't understand the data models or the calculations. Without me, he was completely lost. And it showed in his presentation. The night before the gala, Edward was a nervous wreck. He snapped at me because his shirt wasn't pressed perfectly enough. There was a tiny wrinkle near the collar that apparently would ruin his entire career and future. I apologized softly, took the shirt from his shaking hands, and pressed it again with military precision. Every crease was perfect. I was the picture of the perfect, useless wife. I smiled when he criticized the placement of furniture in our living room. I nodded when he reminded me not to embarrass him in front of important people. I promised to stay in the kitchen most of the evening, out of the way and silent. That night, I barely slept. Not because I was nervous, but because I was excited. Everything was in place, every piece was positioned exactly where it needed to be. Tomorrow night, the game would finally end, and I would win. The gala was stunning, our home filled with the elite of the city, men in expensive suits and women dripping with jewelry that sparkled under the chandeliers. Waiters I had hired circulated with champagne and appetizers on silver trays. The house sparkled. Edward beamed as he shook hands and accepted compliments on his vision for our renovated home. He was in his element. That renovation had been entirely my project. I had hired the contractors, chosen the materials, managed the budget, and solved every problem that came up. Edward had been too busy networking at bars and golf courses to be involved. But tonight, he told everyone it was his idea, his taste, his accomplishment. People congratulated him repeatedly. I moved through the crowd like a ghost, refilling glasses and clearing plates. People thanked me absently, the way you might thank a waitress. No one asked my name. No one asked what I did. I was just Edward's wife. Nothing more. Edward grabbed my elbow and pulled me toward a distinguished older man with silver hair and an expensive watch. "Melanie, this is Mr. Sterling, the CEO," Edward said, his voice dripping with false pride. "Mr. Sterling, this is the wife. She keeps the house running smoothly so I can keep the company running." Mr. Sterling looked me up and down, his expression polite but dismissive. "How lovely," he said in a bored tone. "Edward is lucky to have such support at home. Not many wives are so dedicated these days." I smiled and nodded, playing my role perfectly. Edward squeezed my shoulder like I was a pet who had performed a trick correctly. Then he steered Mr. Sterling away to talk about real business, leaving me standing alone with an empty champagne tray. But I wasn't upset. I was calm. Because I knew something they didn't. The evening was just beginning, and everything was about to change. The doorbell rang, and I moved to answer it myself. When I opened the door, I saw Diane standing there in an elegant black dress, her eyes bright with intelligence and confidence. She wasn't just another guest. She was the newly appointed board chair, a promotion that had happened just last week. I had seen the announcement online. Edward hadn't known about her promotion. When he spotted her across the room, his face went pale. He had been counting on the old board chair, someone he had been schmoozing for months. Diane changed everything. She changed all his plans. She walked straight past Edward without acknowledging him. Instead, she came directly to me and pulled me into a warm hug. "Melanie," she said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear clearly, "it's so wonderful to see the woman behind the Miller strategy." The conversations around us stopped dead. Edward's champagne glass nearly slipped from his hand. His mouth fell open slightly. Edward appeared at my side instantly, his smile tight and confused. "The Miller strategy?" he said with a forced laugh. "No, Diane, that was my proposal. My wife wouldn't know the first thing about market analysis. She doesn't even understand basic spreadsheets." Diane tilted her head, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp as knives. "Really, Edward? That's interesting, because the digital signature on the original drafts belongs to a private LLC registered to Melanie Miller. I checked this morning before I came here." The small group that had gathered around us went completely silent. Edward's face cycled through several emotions: confusion, disbelief, and then a creeping realization that something was very wrong. He looked at me, searching my face for an explanation. I kept my expression soft and pleasant, like always. "There must be some mistake," Edward said weakly. But Diane just smiled and asked me about my consulting business. I answered her questions calmly while Edward stood frozen beside me, his world crumbling. Mr. Sterling approached, his phone in his hand. He had been reviewing documents in the corner, and his expression had changed from bored politeness to sharp interest. "Edward," he said slowly, "I'm looking at the metadata on your last quarterly report. The original file was created by Miller Consulting LLC. Would you like to explain this to me?" Edward laughed nervously, his hand gripping my shoulder too tightly. "Melanie was just typing it up for me," he said quickly. "She helps with the administrative work sometimes. You know how it is with wives, they like to feel useful." I finally spoke, my voice calm and steady. "Edward, I didn't type for you. I created that analysis from scratch. I licensed the data to your firm through my LLC. And actually, your company hasn't paid this quarter's licensing fee yet." I paused, letting that sink in. "Technically, you've been using stolen intellectual property without permission." The color drained from Edward's face completely. He looked like he might faint. The room had grown heavy with tension. Guests pretended not to listen, but everyone was watching our conversation closely. Edward tried to laugh it off, tried to make it seem like a misunderstanding between a husband and wife. But Mr. Sterling wasn't laughing. His expression was cold and professional. "How long has this been going on?" Mr. Sterling asked me directly, ignoring Edward completely now. 3 years, I said simply. I've been providing analysis, market projections, and strategic recommendations that Edward presented as his own work at every meeting. Edward grabbed my arm roughly. "Melanie, what are you doing?" His voice was panicked now, desperate. "We can talk about this later. Privately, please." I gently removed his hand from my arm. "No, Edward, I think now is perfect timing." I looked at the gathered crowd. "I'm so glad everyone enjoyed the house tonight. It's a shame the lease is up soon." Edward frowned at me, confusion mixing with his panic. "What lease? We own this house. What are you talking about?" I shook my head slowly. "Actually, Edward, the holding company owns this house. And I bought out that holding company with my own investment dividends 6 months ago. You've been living in my property. You're essentially a guest here now." The silence was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the carpet. Edward's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Mr. Sterling's eyebrows shot up. Diane smiled into her champagne glass, clearly enjoying the moment. "That's impossible," Edward finally managed. "The house is in both our names. You're lying." "No," I corrected gently. "You put it in a holding company years ago for tax purposes, remember? You never checked on it again." "I did. And now it's mine, completely mine." Mr. Sterling turned to Edward, his expression cold and professional. "Let me understand this correctly. You've been submitting work you didn't create as your own. You've been taking credit for analysis produced by an outside consultant, and you never disclosed this conflict of interest to the firm. Is that accurate?" Edward stammered, trying to form an explanation that made sense. "It's not like that. Melanie is my wife. We're a team. What's hers is mine. That's how marriage works. It's partnership." Mr. Sterling's jaw tightened. "That's not how corporate ethics work, Edward. We've been trying to identify the ghost of Miller for months. We wanted to offer them a director position. Someone with that level of insight is exactly what we need for our expansion." He turned to me. "I assume that's you, Melanie?" I nodded. "Yes, sir, that would be me." "Then I think we have a lot to discuss, but not with Edward present." That's when something unexpected happened. Edward's assistant, a quiet woman named Patricia, whom he had publicly called incompetent more times than I could count, stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. She was holding a thick folder in her hands. "Mr. Sterling," Patricia said, her voice shaking slightly but determined, "I think you should see these documents." She handed him the folder. It's a log of every time Edward was supposed to be working but was actually at the casino, with dates, times, and credit card receipts. Melanie was covering for him the entire time, doing his actual work while he gambled away money. Edward's face went from pale to bright red. "Patricia, you're fired immediately," he snarled. "You can't fire me," Patricia said quietly. "You don't actually have that authority anymore, but I'm quitting anyway. I've been waiting for the right moment for months. This feels right." I reached into my clutch and pulled out an envelope. I handed it to Edward with steady hands. He looked at it like it might explode in his face. "What is this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Open it," I said. He tore it open, pulling out several pages of detailed documentation. His eyes scanned the words, and I watched his face change as he understood what he was reading. It was an invoice. 3 years of consulting services, itemized and calculated carefully. Every report, every analysis, every late night I had spent fixing his mistakes, all of it priced at standard industry rates. "This is insane," Edward whispered. "You can't bill me for, this is my wife." "For professional work?" I interrupted. "Yes, Edward, I can. You've been telling everyone I'm useless at business, so let's treat this like business. You used my services. These are the fees owed." I smiled. "Happy anniversary, Edward. You always said I should be more useful with money." The gala dissolved into chaos quickly. Guests made awkward excuses and left as fast as they could without running. Mr. Sterling pulled me aside and asked if I would be available for a meeting Monday morning, without Edward present. Diane hugged me again and whispered, "I knew there was something brilliant about you. I could tell from the beginning." Edward stood in the center of our living room, surrounded by empty champagne glasses and half-eaten appetizers on silver trays. He looked smaller somehow, like he had physically shrunk. The man who had called me useless, who had waved me away like furniture, who had built his entire career on my silent work. That man was crumbling right in front of me. He looked at me across the room, and for the first time in years, he really saw me. Not as decoration, not as domestic glue, but as the architect of his destruction. After the last guest left, Edward cornered me in the kitchen. His eyes were red and swollen, and his voice cracked when he spoke. "How could you do this to me?" he asked. "You're my wife. You're supposed to support me, not destroy me. This is betrayal, Melanie." I set down the wine glass I had been washing and turned to face him directly. "I did support you, Edward. For years and years. I built your career while you tore me down. I made you look brilliant while you called me useless in front of everyone." I paused. I wasn't cold or calculating. I was just doing exactly what you taught me to do, being domestic. And part of being domestic is cleaning up messes. I'm just finishing the spring cleaning now. He started crying then, big gasping sobs that shook his shoulders. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'll change. I promise I'll change. Please, Melanie, don't do this." But I felt nothing except relief. The game was over. I had won completely. The divorce was quick and clean. Edward had nothing to fight with. I owned the house, I owned my business, I had documentation of everything he had done. His firm terminated him for ethics violations and fraud. The senior partner position went to someone else who actually deserved it. His career, built entirely on my work, collapsed in spectacular fashion. Patricia called me a few weeks later. She had been hired by a competitor at double her old salary. She thanked me for giving her the courage to stand up. I told her she had always had that courage. She just needed the right moment to use it. She cried on the phone. Diane offered me the director position at Edward's old firm. I accepted immediately. My first day, I walked past Edward's old office. Someone else's name was already on the door. His things were gone. 6 months later, I sat in my own office. The name on the frosted glass door read, Melanie Miller, Principal. Sunlight streamed through the windows, warming the polished desk where I worked on projections for my newest client. My calendar was full of meetings. My bank account was healthy and growing. My home, my actual home, not Edward's, was peaceful and quiet. I poured myself a glass of wine, the same Cabernet from that anniversary dinner. But this bottle was mine. I had bought it with my own money, and I was drinking it in my own space. No one would wave me away. No one would call me useless. No one would take credit for my work ever again. I opened my laptop and reviewed a spreadsheet, smiling at the numbers that represented my success and freedom. The domestic glue hadn't just held things together. I had been the foundation, the structure, the entire building. And now I had built something new, something that was entirely mine. I raised my glass to the empty office and whispered, "To new beginnings." Then I got back to work on my next project.